name is Marianne. I'm creating a visual abstract to accompany our recent publication. The purpose of this is to make the research easier to understand for the general public and also to help the science community decide whether they want to spend the time to read the actual paper. If you're interested in our work and want to keep following it, you can go to my lab website. We're located in the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. And of course, by following the work of my postdoctoral advisor, Jamil Zaki, this work was largely carried out at the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. We humans, in fact, all group living animals, have this phenomenal capacity to just seamlessly transform the dynamic social signals of other people and even other animals around us into inferences of what we think the signaler's internal state may be. The success of social signaling depends both on the intended meaning of the target signal, here are the targets, and the interpretation of that signal by an observer. Here in this octopus example, we can see that this target is signaling something related to territorial boundary aggression, and the observer octopus seems to be interpreting that signal and relaying its own signal of acquiescence, possibly to avoid some type of conflict. And I think personally that the animal kingdom is very clear in their signals, far less nuanced than we see in human interaction. For example, even though this is a stock photo, it's kind of tough to tell, is this just playful banter, or is the target in this situation actually defending their boundary as earnestly as this octopus might be? And I think getting this right for our observers, it's really important for our observers to get this right, because signal misinterpretation can result in conflict, and conflict is costly. Relationship quality can determine not just our quality of life, but even our health outcomes. And a lot of conflict can lead to social isolation and depression. All right, to understand how the observer's brain processes social signals, we aimed in this study to disentangle the target's intent, that is, how the target says they actually feel, from the observer's inference, and that is what the observer thinks the target feels. The targets in our study come from the Stanford Emotional Narratives dataset. Here is a cartoon depiction of a real person, but this is a real naturalistic dataset of actual people telling true personal stories about both positive and negative moments in their lives. And we sub-selected 24 videos from this larger dataset. If you are interested in this dataset, which was curated by Desmond Ong, you can access it online for your own studies. The most important thing about this dataset is that it includes self-ratings made by the targets themselves. So we actually know what the storyteller was truly feeling moment by moment as they told their story. And we know this because after they've recorded their video, immediately afterwards, they watch their video and they rate themselves moment by moment on a bivalent scale. Here for this study's purposes, we converted it to emotional intensity, so they're rating themselves from low to high on emotional intensity. Now, 100 participants, largely recruited from the Stanford community in Palo Alto area, go inside the fMRI scanner and they observe these videos. And as they observe these videos, they rate live, moment by moment, what they think the storyteller is feeling on the same exact scale. There's a lot of variance in the accuracy of our observers' inferences, both across observers in general and also within observers across videos. Here is one summary metric plotting that, where we see the average target self-rating for a video plotted in a correlation with each observer's average inference rating for a whole video. And you can see sometimes it's tightly correlated and sometimes it's not correlated at all. So our first question of the brain activity is actually a quite ambitious one. We ask, can a target's intended signal, their actual self-ratings, be decoded from the observer's brain activity? I'm going to get moderately technical and then zoom out and give you an overview. So the first thing that we do is convert the intended ratings into intensity quintiles. So they get converted basically to 5 levels. We know, because these are time series, we know when those levels occur in time. So we can use that information to model the observer's brain activity, the time series of their brain activity at the first level. So for the neuroscience audience, we are just constructing your basic univariate subject level general linear model with this, right? So we're going to get a brain map for every single person for each quintile, and then we're going to train an algorithm to predict those intensity levels from the feature set, which is all the voxels in the brain, okay? And the algorithm that we use is Lasso PCR, which is a linear algorithm that has feature selection kind of baked into it. So the overview of that in simple terms is that we take the observer's brain activity and we train a model that tries to predict what the target said that they felt. One of the benefits of using a linear algorithm is that after you train up your model, you can plot the predictive weights directly back onto the brain, so you can see those weights plotted here. This is just portraying the cortical surface of the brain, but so you know, the cerebellum is involved in this full model. Below here, you can see the cross-validated training accuracy plotted as each fold. The average training accuracy measured by Pearson's R is 0.65, and this is quite good for our field. People from machine learning would probably not be satisfied with this level, but if you look in our supplementary, you can see a comparison of our accuracy to similar models, and for something of this sample size to predict something like emotion, this is pretty high. Importantly, this was validated in a held-out dataset that was comprised of similar unanalyzed trials from the same participants. Please go into the supplementary to learn more about our validation set. To give you a sense of feature importance here, we did some thresholding of the brain weights that are plotted up here, and you can see that the angular gyrus precuneus and the anterior insula are among the brain regions that are most important for this prediction. All right, if you're with me, this part is going to be easier. Now we're asking, can the observer's inferences be decoded from the observer's brain activity? This is a much safer bet. We do basically the same procedure, but here, instead of trying to predict the target self ratings, we're predicting the observer's inference ratings. These are the ratings that the observers, the people in the scanner, made as they watched the story. So they're inferences of what they think the target was feeling moment by moment. And we see that this model performs pretty much just as well as the first model. Again, we validate it in the held out set, and we actually get a really nice double dissociation here where we see the performance in the held out inference validation set is even better, significantly better than its performance on the held out intent data set. Again, we threshold just to give you a sense of feature importance, and we see that significant weights are in the bilateral anterior insula, the temporal pole, and primary somatosensory cortex. So we successfully decoded target intent and observer inferences from the observer brain activity. But you might say, hey, how do you know that these are different things? To ensure that the training data that went into making our models were unique, what we did at each level of intensity, we trained a support vector machine classifier to see if it could distinguish between the training data for the intent model and the training data for the inference model at each level of intensity. And it was able to do that with fairly high accuracy. Okay, now that we've trained and we've validated these two models related to social signal processing, we ask, can these models be used? Can we combine them to predict individual differences in empathic accuracy? So empathic accuracy is, are our observers getting it right? As our observer watches the target tell their story, are they making the right inferences about what that target's feeling? We're able to test this out because we can compare the two traces, right? We know what the target says that they're feeling, and we know what the observer is making an inference of. So we can compare those two traces and see if somebody's getting it right or wrong. To answer this, we go back to the subject level data and we generate a new test data set. So first, we go back and we want to model the time points when our observers are getting it completely wrong. We mean maximally different, where the target is saying, I feel a 1, and the observer's saying they feel a 5. We want to take those time points and we're going to model the observer's brain activity during those time points when they get it wrong. They are just completely and utterly getting it wrong. Likewise, we're going to search through our observer's traces and we're going to find times when they are on the money, when they are getting it absolutely right. Our target's saying, I feel a 5, and our observer's saying 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. When we get those moments of perfect accuracy, we model that time point and we get these brain maps of the periods of time when they're getting it right. Okay, so now we're going to do something a little interesting. We're going to now apply the models that we trained to these new subject level maps to test how our model's predictions relate to observers' empathic accuracy. And one thing I want to kind of highlight here is that empathic accuracy isn't a brain process, right? Empathic accuracy is the outcome of some brain process, right? So keep that in mind. What we're doing here is we're trying to see if our model's predictions combined can predict the outcome of that process, if it can predict an individual person's empathic accuracy. Here, when we correlate the model's predictions across all participants, we find that the predicted level of intended intensity and inferred intensity are weakly correlated. There's high variance across the scatter plot here of dots. Store that R right here, keep this in mind, and we're going to come back to it in a second. Now, when we do this with the high accuracy trials, when they're getting it right, we find that there's actually a very strong correlation between the prediction of the two models. And if we plot that R value here and we compare these two using a Fisher z-test of the correlation difference, we find that there is significantly greater alignment between the model predictions when participants are making more accurate inferences. Of course, we went to our held out validation data and we replicated the finding in there as well. The last thing we did was highly exploratory. Maybe what's going on is that as a person is watching the story, they have these automatic schemas of what someone's emotional intensity could be. Those are getting activated. They could be activated maybe even before a conscious inference is created, and that information is being transformed ultimately into a conscious inference so they can perform the task. When somebody's getting it wrong, when there's maximal difference between the target intent pattern in the brain and the observer's inference pattern in the brain, can we find a set of brain regions that can predict a person's inference? So here what we do is take, again, that brain activity during just the low empathic accuracy trials, and we take the pattern expression, so this is literally the dot product, and we are going to control for that in a univariate regression. Not going to get too fancy here. These brain data here are going to be our predictors, our X. It's going to predict the pattern expression of the inference model. When we do that, we get this set of brain regions here. Some of the brain regions that we see that come out as important in this exploratory analysis include primary somatosensory cortex and the parahippocampal gyrus. So in summary, the intended emotional intensity of another person can be predicted from an observer's brain activity. And we also found that an observer's inferences about another person's emotional intensity can also be predicted from the observer's brain activity. And that the brain patterns that are predicted of signal intent and inference are actually completely dissociable. And that when these brain-based patterns of signal intent and inference align in their predictions, our participants actually yield more accurate inferences. So there's something about the alignment of this brain activity that is related to the outcome of their performance on this empathic accuracy task. Thank you very much for your attention, and of course all the people that were involved directly in this paper. Thank you.